Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be tuning in from. Happy to report we have an actual backdrop, not a virtual backdrop as of this moment. Jason, good to see you. This is episode 85 in our Industry Insights now, going on almost exactly 2 years. We're going to double click again on some research data for you. But before we jump into that, if you're new to the show or haven't been on in a while, we ask that you just give us a little comment where you may be tuning in from. We're TriCasting on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook as well. But give us a comment. We do have a social media team that's watching for that, and we will update a global map as we go through the episode here. But Jason, speaking of, just in case you're not familiar, tell us a little bit about what we're going to double click on today and where it's drawn from.
Yeah, so we're drawn from what is believed to be the largest independent data protection research project ever published, just short of 3,400 organizations from around 28 countries around the world. Veeam sponsored a independent research company, Vance & Born, to go out and survey all of these organizations. Almost all of them, by the way, are at least 1,000 users, so enterprises by most definitions that are out there. And so far, we've looked at a couple different aspects of this particular research endeavor. We're going to double down on one of them. But Dave, how about we kind of bring up a couple of the highlights that got us to where we are now? Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
So some of the top questions that we had when we first began the project were around, what would drive change? Why are you changing, or would you change your current data protection solution to something different? And you can see, if you look back on, this is episode 85, but if you go back to episode 80 back in early February, you'd see that, the macro trends were around reliability, improving qualitatively improving backup, economics fared in there, but nestled in between a couple of those others, the fifth most popular and most common, actually, by both measures, was embracing cloud as part of a data protection strategy. So this is leveraging the cloud in protection. Converse to that, we also asked organizations about what does enterprise backup mean to you, and what would drive a new enterprise backup solution. So a little bit different nuance on the question. And interestingly enough, when enterprises were asked what's the most important thing that they're looking for in their next enterprise backup solution, it was to embrace IaaS and SaaS workloads. So looking at cloud for both production and protection, between things that we covered in episodes 80 and 81. And again, by the way, you can find those on the LinkedIn live stream on the event section. You can find them on, I think, YouTube and pretty much any place that Veeam broadcasts. Go back and take a look at those two elements as well. Dave, I think this kind of sets up a bigger picture around cloud. What else did you see from these that we should draw to before we move forward?
Yeah, well, I really liked your commentary that we've talked about in the past about how the last 2 years has been a lot of change, a lot of activities going on, but a lot of change in terms of where workloads are being instantiated, some cases lift and shift, in some cases acceleration to infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and of course, software as a service. But you really made the point that organizationally, people had to make a pivot because maybe they couldn't get into the data center. Nowadays, even still, you may not be able to get supply chain issues being what they are, the servers that you want. So you had to actually move out to the cloud, burst maybe even faster than you might have otherwise planned to. So what does that mean in 2022? It means that you probably now have to make sure that you've answered availability, meaning backup and recovery, disaster recovery. So you've moved production. You've got a good saying here. What do you need to do with protection?
Yeah, if you modernize production, you got to modernize protection. Those have to follow. And I think you're right, Dave. I think when in 2021, we reimagined a lot of production, and in many cases, we might have modernized production and actually moved from well-protected on-prem to under-protected, especially among those cloud-hosted workloads. And that's going to kind of set us up for the other half of this conversation. So the third question that was asked, also from, I think it was episode 81 maybe, was when organizations were asked, what does modern data protection look like today? And we've gone ahead and muted out some of these because, Dave, we see cloud show up in 4 different elements across this list. This is pretty surprising. Or maybe it's not surprising, just inspiring.
And, if you look at this, when we stack rank these, choose all apply in the long bars, stack rank here in the shorter bars, you add all that up and you get to 49%, essentially half of the responses actually start to show cloud as being really a critical component, a defining characteristic of modern and innovative. But, I also like one of your talk tracks on this, where even when we see something lower on the list, it doesn't inherently mean lower on importance. It's somewhat more of a reflection of what don't I think I have covered yet, and what do I think I either can get my arms around or I can easily multi-source. So, for example, on the cloud notion there, ability to move workloads from on-prem to cloud, that is absolutely still important. It just may not be as concerning or as unanswered of a question as disaster recovery as a service.
Yeah. I mean, because if you think about it, any hyperscale cloud provider is going to give you a way to get your workload into their cloud, right? So Amazon will get you from on-prem into the Amazon cloud. Won't get you back again, but it will get you into EC2, right? Azure will get you up into Azure. Won't get you back again, but it will get you up into Azure, right? And so every workload, and by the way, this is true, 15 years ago, VMware had a tool that would get you from physical to virtual, wouldn't put you back again, right? That's not their job. And so it's interesting that when we look at this, you kind of see three bands. At the bottom, yes, you can get your data up into a cloud. And a couple years ago, that was perceived as modern or innovative. Today, it's table stakes. There's lots of ways to get something up into a cloud. At the top of the screen, you see really, again, that embracing of hybrid for production and protection, right? So on the top one, the idea of being able to use elastic infrastructure for disaster recovery, use it when you need it, don't have it on when you don't. Love that. And then, of course, embracing the fact that you're going to have workloads that are fluid between on-prem physical, on-prem virtual, IaaS, and SaaS. Stuff is going to move around, making sure you have consistency of protection. But Dave, you were the first one to really latch on how special that element is in the middle. Talk about that one for a second, because that really is a unique differentiator in the conversation.
Yeah, and I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we have to plan for things that in some cases we're not even certain in advance what those outcomes might be or what the motivations for making pivots might be. So that ability to shift workloads from where you might be at today to another cloud solution tomorrow and vice versa, as well as potentially even repatriating data back in the data center. If we want to put a finer phrase on that, it could really be around cloud mobility, data portability, and the need to make sure that you don't have friction that's otherwise captivating your data and not allowing you to move with the needs of the business. So that notion there, while 12% actually ranked at the highest, most defining characteristic of modern or innovative.
Sure.
I was particularly pleased to see that because that's a pretty forward-looking comment right there.
Yeah, and when we first started watching cloud as an architecture, it wasn't that uncommon that you would see something like developers would use Amazon, especially because that's API land, right? So they would start standing up a workload in Amazon, but oh, by the way, they had weekly quota committed credits in Azure. And so what they really wanted to do was they want to put it in production over in Azure or vice versa, right? It could be either direction. So the idea of actually being able to move something from one workload to another, CFO comes in, has a different kind of arrangement, right? So all kinds of reasons why you might want to swap those around from one to another. Let's take one more slide just to kind of make sure folks understand exactly how real this is, and then maybe we can go to the map after this. So please feel free to pile on and tell us where you're from. But let's do one more slide first and look at how this trend is kind of manifested out. And so, Dave, I love this slide. Most of the time we've been talking about the data protection report. It has 3,400 in on it, and that's already really, really impressive. This particular data has 8,000 IT organizations on it across most of the same 28 countries year over year over year. This is actually 3 different reports pulled together. This also is from episode 81, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on it. couple things you should take away. The lime green on the each one, that's 2020. That was pre-COVID. The other four bands of each kit is post-COVID. So you can see how organizations really did hyper-accelerate into leveraging cloud more during that first year of quarantine during the pandemic. But after that, you see some really nice, easy trends. One, the data center never goes to zero, right? It's a very gradual decline. And in fact, I would argue that what's really happening is not that you're decommissioning anything. I haven't heard anybody who's saying, yeah, we're just decommissioning a whole bunch of blinky boxes, right? That's not what's happening. What's happening is as workloads are being spun up, if the workload can go to the cloud, so a true authentic cloud first strategy, they're standing it up in the cloud, and that means that they're diluting the percentage of servers that are still physical or virtual, which is what you see on the left or the middle sides of the screen. But this kind of shows it's a plateauing, right? So roughly 50-50 physical to virtual in the data center, 50-50 data center to cloud hosted. Dave, I think this is our new reality.
Yeah, I like this slide because to your point, it's 8,000 data points, multiple years, and it really proves what we've all been talking about now for a while, that hybrid cloud, multi-cloud is a reality or soon to be. This right here basically says we are already in that world. And technically in the next 9 months or so, we start to dip into where a very slight majority of the workloads will be cloud native, cloud resident. So I like the notion nothing completely goes away. Now, if you're an IT practitioner, though, that's a good news, bad news situation potentially, meaning it's good to have flexibility. It's good to have options. To your point, it also means management doesn't want to decommission anything, doesn't actually want to move away from things any faster than they have to. And I always like to use the phrase, Jason, if something is still on a physical server in your data center, there's probably a very good reason why in 2022 that's the case. It is a very critical application. It's an application that runs on a special operating system. In other words, there are unique needs such that it is difficult to move that, but it's obviously important to the business, or someone else would have looked at, can we refactor that? Can we move on to something else? So in terms of running the business, it basically says we've got to look at, for the foreseeable future, a number of different deployment models.
That's right. And really that should be the takeaway, right? And we saw that in the change drivers on backup on the first slide. We saw that in what does modern look like in backup. It was on the I think the third slide-ish. Just the recognition that you're going to have physical, virtual, and multi-cloud platforms in both IaaS and SaaS for the foreseeable future, which means you should be looking at a data protection strategy that is holistic of all of them, and bonus points for if you can provide consistency of protection as those workloads fluidly move from one platform to another, because that's what the business really does expect. So let's do this. So looks like we're not quite ready for the map yet. So let's go ahead and lean in a little bit more. So this screen is all looking at production. Yep. And embracing physical and virtual in cloud. Shall we take a look at what protection in cloud looks like and then double back on the map? We're a little late on the map this morning, so apologize for that. Let's take a look at the next one and see where the cloud is fitting overall. On this next piece, what you're going to see is, again, 8,000 data points. Again, 3 years worth of projects interleaved year over year. What you actually don't see on here is there's actually 3 choices being added together. So on the bottom of each one, organizations reported what percentage of them had backup solutions that only leveraged on-premises technologies. So disk, that could be dedupe, it could be disk object, it could be local NAS, whatever it is, on-prem. Tape actually also counts too, nothing that left the building. And then on the cloud side, the lime green on the top, that can include both managed services like backup as a service and DR as a service, but also simply leveraging cloud storage as a tier. So whether or not cloud is part of your data protection strategy or not. In 2020, it was about 3 out of 5 pro cloud, 2 out of 5 not yet cloud. Fast forward into 2022, we're about 2 to 1. So 67% are cloudy and 1/3 not quite yet. Dave, the line here is nearly perfect from a data perspective.
Yeah, the directionality of it's really kind of, inignorable, if that's a word. You see the trend. We've talked about the trend. But what I also like is, got to make the point again, that doesn't mean something goes to zero. In this case, the deployment model goes to zero. It could well be, as we'll see in the next slide, that people have made investments, not just in infrastructure, but in facilities.
Yeah.
They've got lease long-term activities that they want to uphold. So just from an overall business perspective, even if they're looking at going more cloud powered, they might be hanging on to either equipment or facilities for another year or however long their commitments may be for, in which case that might explain why we expect to see a jump coming into next year. But again, probably for the most of us, majority of the organizations, it doesn't go to zero. If we were a smaller organization, or if we were newer, just starting out, if this was the Jason Dave show, we would probably have laptops, monitors, and everything else as a service.
Amen, amen, amen. So, if it was the Jason and Dave show, then this thing would just be running between Colorado and Texas. But chances are there's some friends out there that we should say hi to as well. Shall we check out the map and see where folks are?
Yeah, definitely want to give a shout out. Canada, of course, jumps right out at you.
There you go.
You get a lot of green mileage for there. Obviously, Brazil. Looking at the United States, we see Ohio, Illinois, Florida, Minnesota, Tennessee, Massachusetts, Georgia. And if we look across rest of world, I see Czech Republic. I left out Panama. I am so sorry. Thank you, Panama in Central America. Do see Czech Republic. Also see Kenya, India. Kenya might be one that's a little bit newer for us, Jason. I don't know if we've had Kenya in a while.
We have not had Kenya in a while. And the only reason I remember that is because Kenya is on my list of countries I certainly want to see someday on my bucket list. And I have not had that chance yet. So thank you, Kenya, for joining.
Brilliant, brilliant.
All right. Well, let's go back and finish the conversation on this. So there's a nuance in this that that's probably worth unpacking when we look at this. So we said 8,000 data points, right? The nuance is that basically the way we got this is in 2020, we asked, what are you doing in 20, and what do you think you're going to do 2 years out? Right. In 2021, we asked about 21. What do you think it's going to be in 23? You see both of those on the chart. And then in 2022, what are you doing in 22? What do you think it's going to be in 24? I do think it's interesting that in 2021 to 23, they thought they were going to go. I'm just going to use the cloudy numbers from 66 to 81. Right. But a year later, they didn't actually make as much progress as they had hoped to, right? So 66 only became 67, but in 67 they said, but they think it's going to be in 79. So there's still that intent, right? There's still roughly, 15 points, and then the other one is 14 or 12 points. So yeah, so there's still split the difference, 1 in 13. So it's 1 in 7 organizations. There's still 1 in 7 organizations that year over year are still saying we're not as cloudy as we want to be. We want to add more cloud to our data protection solution, or they just want to hand over the whole darn thing and let some managed backup as a service provider just, like a Calgon commercial, just take me away. Right? I want someone else to manage that backup for me. But I do think it's.
Did we freeze here on Jason's feed? Perhaps we did. I do want to give a shout out. We had a question or a comment really come in from Alexi. And Alexi says, as we see, clouds are not always secure, and they could suddenly be disconnected from cloud connectivity depending on outages, or if there are any other kind of issues going on. And it brings up a really important point, and many of us have probably talked about or heard of the shared responsibility model. It's still your data, even if data is born in the cloud or it's hosted in the cloud from a software as a service provider or a platform as a service provider. It's still up to you to ensure from an availability continuity perspective that you have a copy of that data, or that you have other plans for being able to make that data available to the business, right, Jason? I mean, it's just, you can't vend this out and say, I wrote someone a check, they'll handle everything.
Yeah, you really can't, right? And so, and that's a really valid concern, as far as, okay, so the cloud cannot be your only solution. I think I would make the argument that if you're thinking about data protection, say of remote office, back office, so a broadly distributed set of infrastructure where you don't have anyone outside of that particular location who needs access to the data, so school systems, K-12, regional shopping, those kinds of things, for them, backup as a service as a complete solution probably makes sense, because what you're really looking for is just retention of data and survivability of data. But for a lot of folks, if you're looking at supplementing your data center solution, this is why you still have to have some backups on-prem. This is why, if you still have multiple data centers, it's why Veeam has backup copy jobs, right? Copy, you should have, I don't know, Dave, in my world, I like 30 to 90 days on premise. I like it. And then everything past 90 days, mostly in a location. Maybe this is something that tells us, hey, you know what? I need a monthly copy out to some remote office, some distribution center, some closet, that's not in the same zip code. And then I'm still going to operationally leverage cloud as my long-term retention tier. Right. And so there's certainly ways you can blend that together. But if you ever needed an argument for not all your eggs in one basket or one cloud, we're seeing it.
Yeah, and I do want to give a special kind of mention, if you will, to Microsoft 365, because there are a lot of SaaS applications. If you get a copy of that data, you could sort of forensically go in and maybe get a phone number out of something. But I always like to point out that the Microsoft applications are really perhaps the only corollary where you've got something where you can run and access that data on-prem, meaning local Outlook. You could have SharePoint. You could have OneDrive.
Sure.
You could have the ability to actually not just go and get a bit of information out of it, but actually to do meaningful work. So all the more reason why a hybrid approach to M365 with some on-prem capability as well as managed services, but you yourself having control over that data, having a backup copy at the ready so that you can access it if there was a discontinuity in service, makes your organization much more available.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm looking at the clock. There's one more part of this question to be answered, and that is there's backup, right? So just having survivable data, long-term retention. We've used those terms interchangeably in this case. But let's talk about disaster recovery, because that's a little bit different, right? In backup, we just want the data to survive. In disaster recovery, our expectation is that some amount of on-prem infrastructure has had a catastrophic event. Right? Could be a rack, could be a data center, could be a building, could be a closet. But somewhere along the way, our goal is now to resume functionality with alternate infrastructure. In this case, let's make it cloudy, or should we? Right. So what you're looking at here again, 8,000 data points, 3 years in the making. When you look back at when you look on the bottom, this is 2 or more data centers protecting each other. Right. So East Coast protects West Coast. Singapore protects Japan. U.S. goes to UKI. Some variation of twin data centers protecting each other. And when you do that, roughly about 30% of organizations still embrace that. And Dave, our message to them is keep doing that. Yeah. Right? If you're working that and you have skills in both locations and you own all the technology in both cases, there's a huge amount of agility that comes from a dual data center approach.
Yeah, I think it's just, I use the phrase asset management, but if you have that kind of capability, if you've made that kind of investment as an organization, there's no inherent reason to turn that off, turn that to zero, if you still have a good business outcome associated with that. Now, for some, maybe your capital expenses are such that it's time to let that other solution go, that secondary data center. But the notion of there's not necessarily a right and inherently wrong answer here. It really comes down to workloads, right solution for the right kind of data.
Yeah, I will put a plug in. I know we're talking cloudy today, but when you do have those dual data centers, I can't think of anything you ought to be thinking more about than our orchestrator product to make sure those 2 data centers are really able to protect each other. But for today's conversation, let's look on the top of the chart. Right. So when we look at leveraging cloud infrastructure as part of your DR plan. You see that go from 23 to 30 to 36, 51, 53. That's where all the growth is happening. And Dave, I'm gonna suggest there's probably two, in my mind, at least two key variables as to why that's happening. One, for a lot of organizations who don't have more than one data center or who don't want to sustain two data centers, having that elastic infrastructure, having those secondary servers without dropping new metal is very, very compelling. It's especially interesting for, say, upper commercial, lower enterprise where they didn't have the data centers, but they're just as dependent on their data. Being able to spin that up in a cloud becomes really, really interesting. But also, I got to give props to all my DRaaS providers out there, because you provide not only secondary infrastructure, you provide expertise, right? You provide those smart BCDR folks that can actually help an organization be successful. And the organizations that can't afford a second data center also can't afford a full-time BCDR experts. And so I think DRaaS providers help enable the expertise as well as that secondary infrastructure. And that's really exciting to me because of it means more people can do BCDR when they're ready.
Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point. I'm just being told we got a couple other map updates. Couple more states in the United States, Utah and Arizona. Arizona, where I just moved from a little bit ago, and
Nice.
2 additional countries of Turkey and Pakistan over in Europe. So shout out to everyone there. Thank you very much for letting us know where you're coming in from. And as we begin to wind down, Jason, do you want to just give another hit to where this data comes from, the Veeam Data Protection Trends Report? Again, Jason mentioned at the outstart, this is the largest ever research collection around backup recovery availability in the history of our space. You can download it here, simple URL. I always like to use the phrase, Jason, you owe it to yourself to get educated. I promise it's not a Veeam commercial by any stretch of the imagination. It is independent research conducted by a third-party firm, letting you know what's going on trend-wise globally across a number of questions. And believe it or not, as many episodes as we've done, Jason, around this report, we probably could do another couple months worth. There's that much data in there.
We could, but unfortunately, our producers won't let us. We're going to have to go find some new topics to talk about starting next week. But speaking of new topics, you probably will see a little bit of DPR on this next one, but we'll have some more data to share by then as well. There's this little shindig we're doing out in Vegas in May, aren't we?
Yeah, in fact, registration just opened up for that this morning U.S. time. So a couple of hours ago, it went live, about 2.5 hours ago. We're going to have a hybrid event. We've been talking hybrid, Jason. Now it's a hybrid event. So it will be in person for those that choose to attend May 16th, 19th back in Las Vegas. But it will also be virtual for those that are not in a position to travel or may have other work commitments. And that hybrid notion, meaning the virtual component, is no charge to be able to sign up for that. And as we look ahead a little bit, speaking of events, we're actually going to have 3 Veeam live streams this week. Wednesday, we've got some activity going on at HIMSS. That's an acronym for Healthcare Information and Management Systems Society. I think of it, Jason, HIMSS for healthcare is kind of like what RSA is for security, kind of like what VMworld is for the virtualized space, and of course what Veeam is for Veeam. It's a collection of technologists centered around healthcare. We're going to do a live update Wednesday from HIMSS.
Nice.
Speaking of, now coming full circle, combining Veeam, our Friday Tech Bites is going to give an early preview of what to expect at Veeam. We've always liked to do demonstrations, make some announcements, do a little bit of, what's been going on in the last year or so, but there's always surprises that drop, Jason.
Yeah, Veeam, I think I've been to, or at least participated in every Veeam that we've done. It is one of my favorite events of the year. In fact, the first 4 I did before I joined Veeam. If you can spell backup, so can every other person at this event. You owe it to yourself to come. All right, I think that's it for this week, Dave.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining, everyone. Stay safe, stay positive, and we'll see you on the next live stream. Bye for now.